So this evening we have two speakers, one from either side of the Irish Sea. We have Sandra Henry from the Discovery Programme and Louise Barker from the Royal Commission. I'll invite you to type your questions into the Q&A box that you'll see on the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. I'll put those questions to Sandra and Louise at the end of the session. So Sandra is going to begin proceedings introducing the project and outlining the project's research on Promontory Forts in Ireland, and then Louise will take over and introduce us to the project's research on Promontory Forts in Wales. Sandra is a lead research archaeologist for the CHERISH Project and is based in the Discovery Programme. She obtained her BA degree in Archaeology and Classical Studies from the National University of Ireland in Galway and an MA in Maritime Archaeology at the University of Southern Denmark. Sandra has worked as a maritime archaeologist in various capacities, including research, commercially and for public bodies. And Sandra's broad interests include nautical archaeology, Neolithic archaeology, and maritime cultural heritage management. Specific areas of interest are prehistoric seafaring, human interaction and movement, naval warfare, maritime cultural landscapes, and underwater archaeological survey and recording methods. So Louise and I are going to disappear now and let Sandra start her presentation.
Okay, thanks very much for the introduction, Linda. So I'm just going to talk about climate change impacts that we're noticing during the work we're undertaking in the CHERISH project. So we're specifically going to look at the Promontory Fort today. So this is one of the site types that we're investigating as part of the ongoing work in Ireland and Wales. So I'm going to start off with just giving you a little bit of an introduction to the CHERISH project and the type of work we undertake and why we're undertaking it as well. So CHERISH is a EU-funded project. It's running from 2017 to the end of 2022. We have 4 different project partners. There's ourselves in the Discovery Programme, which is an archaeological research company, and we're working with the Geological Survey of Ireland. We're then working with our project partners in Wales, the Royal Commission on the Ancient and Historical Monuments of Wales, and then we're working with the Geography Department in Aberystwyth University. So what is CHERISH? Well, CHERISH itself is actually an acronym for Climate, Heritage and Environments of Reefs, Islands and Headlands. So the main objective of the CHERISH project is to raise awareness and understanding of the past, present and near future impacts of climate change on the rich cultural heritage of the Irish Sea zone. So we're doing this by undertaking a number of different routes of investigation. We're reconstructing past environments and weather histories. We're discovering, assessing, mapping and monitoring heritage on land, and we're also mapping heritage underwater. So we're targeting data and knowledge gaps to raise awareness of heritage in these remote coastal locations, and then we're establishing new metrically accurate baseline data and recording standards for the project areas we're working in. So with CHERISH, we're investigating a number of different climate change impacts and how they're impacting our coastal and underwater cultural heritage. So one of the impacts we see is warmer global temperatures, and this is denoted on the infographic by the numbers 1 and 2. So what we're seeing is rising sea levels. So this is causing a variety of different impacts, from inundation on to increased damage due to sea levels encroaching on heritage sites, and more extreme damage during storm events. Then number 2 is where we're starting to see changes in sea temperatures, and this is resulting in warmer seas, which is causing increased salinity. Then we're getting increased acidity as well. And then we're also seeing changes in our marine ecosystem due to these changes. And so what we're beginning to see is the movement of more invasive species into different bodies of water than where there would have previously been. So for example, marine boring worms we're seeing on wreck sites, and these are impacting underwater and foreshore wrecks in areas where previously they wouldn't have. Then with hotter, drier summers, we're seeing also a number of impacts, and they're denoted on the infographic by the numbers 3 to 5. So what we're seeing is the drying out of cliff faces, and this is causing increased instability and destabilization. And like sites in particular that we're seeing being impacted by this would be Promontory Forts, for example. This would be one of the type of climate change impacts that would be most affected some of our Promontory Fort sites, along with some of the other ones that I'll discuss in a minute. And then we're also not only getting these negative type of impacts, we're also seeing some positive impacts. So for example, crop marks and parchment marks are identifying and revealing new heritage sites to us as well due to these warmer and drier summers that we're encountering. Then we also are seeing impacts from warmer, wetter winters, and this is denoted by number 6 on the illustration. And what we're seeing here is a more frequent saturation of the ground. So we're seeing this leading to increased risk of flooding and also of landslides. Then with more extreme weather events, such as storms, we're seeing impacts that are denoted by numbers 7 through to 11. So for example, we're seeing structural damage to historic buildings, we're seeing the movement of sand dunes and reshaping of dune systems, because this is revealing hidden heritage, along with also causing increased erosion of heritage that was previously buried. We're also seeing increased wave action, we're seeing erosion and loss all along the coastal edge. And then we're also seeing more turbulent seas, and this is resulting in scarring of shipwrecks, or greater scarring of shipwrecks due to higher energy environments. And then it's also impacting archaeology on the foreshore as well. So with Promontory Forts, a number of the sites we've been working on, we've been seeing extreme impacts from storms, and we discuss some of this a bit later on in the presentation as well. So we're doing the work we're doing in the CHERISH Project by using a variety of different methodologies. So some LiDAR work has been commissioned as part of the CHERISH Project, and that's been undertaken in Wales, and it has for a number of their remote island locations that they're working in. And what we're also doing is assessment of LiDAR data that has already been collected and is available to use. We're undertaking drone surveys, so this is being undertaken in 2 types of ways. We're undertaking UFE surveys in concentrated areas where we're collecting small landscape studies from the site and the surrounding immediate surrounding landscape or hinterland. But then we're also undertaking much larger UFE surveys where we're covering kilometers of coastline. And then we're also investigating the use of satellite mapping in a number of our study areas. We have an aerial photographer who has undertaken an aerial survey of most of our study areas and will have undertaken aerial survey of all of our study areas by the end of the project. And we're also undertaking geophysical survey. So we've undertaken this on a number of different sites. We're both magnetometric survey. We're undertaking paleo-environmental and coring work. So this lets us look back at the past environment and how the environment in our study areas changed over time, along with also revealing evidence of past storm events and past climatic change. Then we're undertaking GNSS survey. This is really important because it allows us to get really accurate positioning for the data sets that we collect, so that we have very nice baseline surveys to compare with our monitoring surveys, so that we can really understand the rates of change that are occurring on the sites we're working on. And then we're collecting laser scan surveys as well. So this has been undertaken for cliff faces and also for built heritage. Cliff faces are typically an area that are particularly hard to map due to their vertical nature by other means of survey. So laser scan is a great way to undertake this type of survey as well. Then we're also revealing stratigraphy and investigating the nature of stratigraphy. And our project partners in Wales have been undertaking a lot of rope access work to reveal are to understand and investigate the nature of revealed archaeological layers and features on some of the sites they're working on. Then we're also undertaking excavation on a number of the sites we're working on as well to gain better understanding of the site types that we're looking at and the usage of these sites. Then we're undertaking multi-beam echo sounder mapping. So this creates maps of the seafloor and it shows us the energy of the environment that we're working in, the type of seabed dynamics that are happening, and it also gives us an opportunity to create visualizations and measure data sets of the wreck sites that we're working on. And then we have underwater archaeologists who are recording these wreck sites and collecting different sorts of survey information in order to be able to monitor them over the course of the project. So in Ireland and Wales, we've different reasons for why we're working in the study areas we're working in. In Ireland, it was a lot of stakeholder engagement and involvement and use of OPW, the Office of Public Work, and their predictive mapping and modelling of flood and erosion areas. And so we're working in North Dublin, East Wexford, the southeast of Wexford. We're working in the Copper Coast and Waterford, and then we're also working on the extremities of the Dingle and Iveragh Peninsula in County Kerry. While our Welsh partners built upon baseline surveys from the 1990s, so they were able to collect monitoring data for some of the services we're already undertaking, and then also stakeholder engagement would have been important for the identification of their study areas as well. So the type of site we're talking about specifically in this talk is the Promontory Fort. So in the Irish archaeological record, there is 573 promontory forts recorded. Of these 573 promontory forts, 508 of them are coastally located. So when we talk about promontory forts, what we typically encounter when we come onto sites such as this is, I'm just going to use my mouse to kind of point out these features here on the site of Drogheda in County Dublin. So you get, often it can be earthen or stone banks and ditches that what they particularly do, or what they kind of achieve, is they cut off the promontory itself from the hinterland behind. And often what we see with the promontory forts we're working on is that they actually take advantage of natural features in the landscape or natural features in the geology of the area and utilize this in creating this separation of the promontory from the hinterland. What we see with promontory forts is typically they're believed to be constructed in the Iron Age. So when we're talking about the Iron Age in Ireland, we're talking about 500 BC to 500 AD. And what we see also with promontory forts very regularly is repeated use of the promontory forts into the medieval period. And we often see this in through different features, and some of which we'll discuss in particular sites later on. But here, for example, in Drogheda, there's later Roman activity on the site. It's a very important site. And what we also see here is a Martello Tower. So the Martello Tower is part of the Napoleonic era coastal defence system that includes Martello Tower and signal towers, and they're located all around the Irish coastline. And what we find quite regularly is these towers being positioned in promontory forts or in very close proximity to promontory forts, which in some ways kind of highlight the preeminent position that these promontory forts do have along the maritime zone, and basically the ability of the position of the promontory fort to be able to monitor sea routes, maritime routeways, and kind of offer an aid in which to patrol maritime traffic. So what we're seeing in Waterford, for example, in the Copper Coast, is a high concentrations of promontory forts in the area we're working in, along the Copper Coast. So that pretty much runs from Dungarvan to Tramore is the area we're concentrating on. And we have 32 promontory forts that are located along a 24-kilometre stretch of coastline. So what we see with the promontory forts in Waterford is obviously the significance of this type of fort type along the southern sea routes of Ireland. You know, it highlights the importance in society, trade and economy. And this kind of is part of the reason why it's so important for us to study these sites, to learn more about different elements of society in the Iron Age and later periods. So here's one site in particular we're working on in Waterford. It's Woodstown Promontory Fort. So this image here on the right shows the banks and ditch of the promontory fort. So as you can see, these are earthen in nature. I think my camera is kind of blocking some of the images to the right, but here we can see one of our project colleagues from the Royal Commission undertaking geophysical survey here in County Waterford. And what we see with the promontory forts in Waterford, and this is pretty common what we're seeing here in the Woodstown Promontory Fort. So Braggs Island, for example, is believed to actually have been adjoined to the mainland during the period of utilisation of the promontory fort. And here actually in this aerial image, you can see quite clearly the banks and ditch. There's been extremely heavy erosion along this area of coastline. And what we see here as well is that actually a coastal path was located here, but it can't be accessed anymore due to the dangerous nature of cliff collapse that is occurring in this area. But we see this frequently with promontory forts, where, especially in County Waterford, where they're now being separated out into sea stocks, into islands due to large cliff collapse and erosion. And this is the type of erosion that takes place over hundreds, sometimes even thousands of years. So this is just one example of the sites here. And then, just gone to Great Salty Island. So this is Great Salty Island. It's located south of Kilmore Quay in Wexford. It's suffering particularly badly along its soft coastline on the east coast, on the west coast, and to the north. So here, for example, at the northern end of the island, we can see there's been substantial erosion, and this is a promontory fort site itself. Here in the digital elevation model that was created from a laser scan survey, we can see the banks of the promontory fort. While here, if we look at this image of the edge of the promontory fort, we can see, if we look at the darker fill here, we can see the ditch of the promontory. It stands out quite starkly against the lighter brown sediment in the area. And we can see there's been quite large erosion and continued erosion. We can see here that the archaeology in particular is being affected. It is being eroded out in this area. Also another location of a promontory fort in a pivotal position along maritime routeways. So then we're going to go over to County Kerry. And what we kind of get in Kerry, in addition, well, in contrast to what we find in Waterford and, say, for example, Dublin and Wexford and some of the other areas we're working in, not exclusively, but kind of on the whole, what we're seeing is in Kerry, it's a lot more common to find stone ramparts and stone walls as part of the defensive system of the promontory fort, where you have the banks and ditches that cut off the promontory itself from the hinterland. So here in Furter's Castle Promontory Fort, there is some evidence of stone walling along some of the banks here. And I'll just actually locate where we are on the map. So we're in County Kerry, we're in the southwest of Ireland, we're on the Dingle Peninsula, and we're over here on the western extremity of it in Ballyferriter, on the Ballyferriter headland. And so this Ferreter's Promontory Fort, it's over 500 meters in length. It is a long, narrow promontory fort. It's, as you can see here on the geological map, what you have is the erosion of softer sediments against harder sediments. So you have two natural inlets here caused by erosion of the sea. So this actually is the area then that was utilised and adapted in order to separate the promontory fort from the hinterland. So we have a set of ditches and banks here, and a set of ditches and banks here. And here we get a few of the promontory fort from seaward, looking back onto the hinterland. So Ferreters has actually been one of the locations. We've had some joint nation field work. So we've all been down on the site, and we've undertaken survey of the site and recording of the different features on the interior of the site. And it is going to be one of the sites that we excavate as part of the CHERISH Project. It originally was planned for 2020, but more than likely now we'll be looking at an excavation date in 2021. So we've identified a number of things we would like to investigate as part of our work here on this promontory fort. We want to investigate the nature of the defences, and we're going to adapt a method that was used by our Welsh partners in excavations they undertook at Distinctly, and by looking at coring as a way in which to investigate the nature of these defences. It's less intrusive, it allows us to achieve a lot more in a smaller time frame. And then we'll also be opening up excavation trenches to investigate the nature of some of our hut sites. And we also will have some test trenches through some of the areas that we find to be of interest. Here you can see them marked out on our digital elevation models. We've also undertaken geophysics. We've undertaken magnetometer and resistivity survey so that we have a basis to work from for undertaking our excavation. So I'm actually going to just talk about Dunbeg really quickly because talking a bit longer than I meant to. But so Dunbeg now, we're still on the Dingle Peninsula. We're on the south side of it, and we have Dunbeg is a really prominent site along the Dingle coastline. It's a very popular tourist destination. It's in a beautiful location. You can see Skellig Michael in the distance. You look across to the Iver Peninsula. You have a great viewpoint over the entrance into Dingle Bay. So I just go through some of the different features we have on the site. This site actually was repaired extensively by the Board of Works at the start of the 20th century. So the features we encounter today have been altered somewhat from what they would have originally looked like. But there's a clachan in the centre here. This is medieval in date. It's later established in the banks and ditches. We have a stone rampart wall. There's a souterrain that runs underneath. Here's the causeway entrance, and here we have another bank, earthen bank. So there was quite a lot of work done in Dunbeg in the second half of the 19th century. There's a number of antiquarian plans. So you have right up until the start of the 20th century a number of different recordings of the site, and the work by the Board of Public Works would have been at the turn of the 19th century, or towards the turn of the 19th century, so 1892. And so you have evidence and recording of the site before the work and after the work, so we can see the way in which it was adapted by the Board of Public Works, such as these in-turning rampart wall features that can be seen here in Westrope's plan of the site in 1910. So the site itself was actually excavated by Terry Barry in 1977 due to the erosion that was occurring on the site, and it was just a method that was implemented in order to obtain as much information from the site before it was lost to the sea. So, but actually, from the 1977 excavation, there was very little damage that occurred to the site until actually the last decade. So a number of major collapses occurred in 2004, or the first major collapse occurred in 2014, and then a number of major collapses continue to occur due to different storm events such as Storm Ophelia and Storm Eleanor. So there was a combination of seaward collapse, and then also there was impact from drainage and inland flooding issues, which also caused quite a lot of damage to the fort. So here's a number of models we've collected of the fort. So for the CHERISH Project, we've actually collected a number more throughout 2019, and this is just one of the earlier infographics which we've undertaken work, but we do know that there's a continual loss of parts of the fort, and we're seeing further loss in areas that are more readily identifiable, such as the rampart wall. So here's one of the earlier plans of Dunbeg. It's from 1898 and from McAllister. And he had actually visited the site a couple of years earlier, so he had known that there was an intern wall that was constructed in 1892 by the Commissioner of Works. So there was obviously a collapse in the 6 years from the construction of the wall until this plan is undertaken. And then we have our survey from June 2017, we have a survey from April 2018, and we can see the huge amount of loss that has occurred on the site. We can see there's over, if we go on to the next image, we can see there's over 25 meters of loss between number 1 and number 5. We can see loss of 10.92 meters between 3 and 4. And this also is a comparison between 2017 and 2018 model. So actually there has been more loss over the last year or two as well. And then we worked out the possible minimum tonnage of soil that was lost from the site, and we worked out at 3,000 cubic meters. So it's substantial losses occurred due to just 2 or 3 storm events that we're discussing from the period from 2017 to 2018. So that's everything I'm going to talk about from the Irish side. So thanks very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Sandra. That was great. So I'm just going to introduce Louise Barker. Louise is a senior investigator with the Royal Commission on Ancient and Historic Monuments in Wales, and she works on as part of the CHERISH team and is primarily involved in ground survey and investigation of heritage sites along the coast of Wales and Ireland as part of the cross-border CHERISH team. She's worked as an archaeologist since graduating from Newcastle University and with a BA in Archaeology in 1996, and she started her career working in contract archaeology for Archaeological Practice Limited in Northern England. She then moved to Cambridge to work for English Heritage as an archaeological investigator before joining the Royal Commission in 2004. Louise specialises in landscape survey and interpretation and has worked on a wide range of sites and landscapes spanning prehistory to the present day. Recent work pertinent to CHERISH has been with Royal Commission colleague Toby Driver on Promontory Forts in Pembrokeshire, and with Toby and Dr. Bob Johnson from the University of Sheffield and Dr. Oliver Davis from Cardiff University on Scomer Island. So just hand you over to Louise now, and don't forget, if you have any questions for Sandra or Louise, please type them into the Q&A box, and we'll I'll ask those for you at the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Linda and Sandra, and hello everybody. We're whizzing across the sea now into Wales, and for those of you not familiar with the area, I really hope that the following talk might entice you to come and visit Wales and the spectacular promontory forts we have here. Well, Island outdoes us on numbers. Along the coast of Wales, we've got around 110 promontory forts. But the main area that undoubtedly have the most is Pembrokeshire, which I'm just searching here on the southwest tip of Wales. And here we have over half the amount of all known promontory forts within Wales, some 58. They're densely packed, and it's a feature which has been commented on for many hundreds of years from visitors visiting the area, as you can see in the quote that we're seeing here. Luckily for us, most of the promontory forts are scheduled monuments. They're also located in the Pembrokeshire Coast National Park, and also accessible to the public who are walking along the Pembrokeshire Coast Path. In Pembrokeshire, they form the main monument type that is being studied by CHERISH in the area. And again, like in Ireland, it's also a monument type that's clearly under threat. As seen in Ireland, their exposed locations at the coast edge make them really vulnerable to erosion, and the effects of climate change with rising sea levels, more extreme weather events such as storms, heat and cold events, pose an increasing significant future threat. In Pembrokeshire, the variety of geology across the county also affects that rate of erosion. In the north of the county, we have much harder bedrocks, predominantly volcanic rocks, and here the promontory forts are not eroding as badly. This is in a real contrast to the south of the county, and here the softer geology, such as the old red sandstones and the carnivorous limestone coasts, are much more vulnerable to erosion and are subsequently eroding relatively rapidly. The images here just really showcase this. Some have virtually disappeared, such as here, Black Point Rath, where we've lost all of the archaeological information with relatively little investigation over the years. On the red sandstone coast, on southern Pembrokeshire at Grenalla, you can see that some of the isolated stacks there's parts of promontories that still survive, but here again we see the major slumping of the coastline. And in plan form, some of these features still survive, but when you visit the site, you realise the archaeology is in fact about 3 metres below the counterparts to the side. On the limestone coast, you really see the impressive landforms of arches and blowholes. Here, sections of the cliff face really are fracturing and peeling away. And one good example of this is at Linney Head, where there's clear erosion, and in some ways it does reveal some of the archaeology. I'm just tracing with my mouse here some of the beautiful rock cut ditch of the outer ditch of the promontory, and the corresponding bank, which we've been recording as part of the CHERISH project. So that represents the monumental collapse, but also here we have other effects of erosion and such things as the wave overtopping during storm events. And with waves which do reach and crash over the height of the promontories here, it's stripping away the really thin but archaeologically rich and valuable topsoils, which contain all of the archaeological evidence. And another part of the CHERISH project will be monitoring the rates of erosion and scouring these sites to recover, hopefully, the archaeology before it's lost. Without saying really that what we see of these sites today is only a small part of the original monument. We're missing the walls, we're missing the fence lines, we're missing the divisions within it. And it's also important to note that with this site in the promontory forts in particular, we've really lost so much of our understanding of the fort. Just in Pembrokeshire, only 100 to 150 years ago, an archaeologist working in the area described that for most promontory forts, they could still see the routes that were used down to the coastline. Most of this is gone now. And unfortunately, it then gives us this perception of what these sites must have been like. You know, the way that we see them today feeds our modern day perceptions of them as remote, exposed and obviously dangerous places. But really, was this really have been the case for the inhabitants of these sites some 2,000 years ago? So what do we know about our promontory forts in Pembrokeshire? They've always taken, they're large-scale monuments which have attracted attention. We have accurate and secure locations on them. A lot of them we have good photography and some form of record or survey plan. What we don't have is excavation evidence of the 58 or so promontories in the county. Only around 7 have been excavated, and the majority of these excavations took place in some cases over 100 years ago, where we don't have the benefit of scientific dating. One of the most recent sites that's been excavated has been done by the Dyfed Archaeological Trust at Porthlerow, which is just shown at the number 11 on the map there. And Porthlerow provides us with an idea of the kind of site and the similarities between the sites that have been excavated. Here we're looking at a monument type which, as in Ireland, was mainly occupied in the Iron Age, and for us here we're looking probably more at a date range from about 700 BC through to the 1st century AD. However, there is clear evidence of some earlier origins at these sites and some later Bronze Age establishments. And also there's showcasing continuing occupation into the Roman period, here into the 3rd and 4th centuries AD. And in some cases, a few fragments and finds which suggest reuse in the medieval period, 12th, 13th century onwards. At Porthlerow in the late 90s, all that's left of this site of the interior is this little finger of land here, and one small excavation trench in this area revealed quite a dense settlement occupation, a series of 7 or 8 round houses, some timber, later more Roman period ones in stone. So it was an occupied settlement. And with finds which you would usually find at most kind of sites from pottery and bone, but also with more exotic and traded goods such as glass beads, and also some evidence of metalwork. So one of the first questions we need to ask, certainly for here and also for those in Ireland, did these coastal sites share similar functions to their inland counterparts? You know, were they a similar site that simply exploited its seaward position for ease of defence, or were they indeed differently? On the one hand, we can say yes, this was a standard late prehistoric settlement site, but we really must consider the role that these played in coastal trade. They would have been really highly visible to those using the seaways in prehistory. And particularly the channels between Wales and Ireland was an important route for local and international shipping, coming from the Atlantic area, along the coast, through past into the Irish Sea and along the coasts of Scotland and the Isle of Man. And it's in all of these locations, from Brittany, through Cornwall, into Wales, Isle of Man, Ireland, and also in Scotland, that we see this monument type. Undoubtedly there would have been contact, goods could have been exchanged, information swapped, and shelter taken. And therefore I think it's really important that we don't see Promontory Forts as remote and a periphery to the activity. They were central to it. Within Pembrokeshire as well, whilst a large proportion of them look to perform settlement sites and occupation, they do exhibit highly variable architecture. And there are a number which really do have some quite unusual characteristics in their topography and in their setting. And we have to also consider different functions among many sites, even some that were closely neighbouring. Some were undoubtedly settlements, such as St David's Head here on the large granite peninsula, where you can see stone roundhouses are still evident, and where excavation has revealed, you know, similar occupation levels, but this is set within a rich prehistoric landscape of field systems and earlier origins of Neolithic monuments. But then we have others which don't quite fit the occupation type. For example, Deer Park here on the lower left of the screen. This is a huge promontory enclosure, one of the largest in Wales, encompassing 23 hectares of the interior. It's defined by this single bank and ditch, 280 metres long, which on the outset, when you're looking at it, looks to be predominantly, you know, defensive in character, defining the area. But as you walk and follow the boundary along, it moves along and actually dips all the way down to the sea, and in many ways then resembles something more of a faraway. Perhaps it enabled access up into the site from the sea, and perhaps this had more trading connotations. It's such a large area. In huge contrast, we move to the south of the county with a tiny mowing wood, what we call a promontory enclosure. It's a tiny finger of limestone, no more than about 4 or 5 meters wide and 20 meters long, but it's still enclosed and defined by specifically cut ditches with a causeway across. As to the purpose of this, we really don't know, but it seems unlikely that it served a purpose as a settlement site, and perhaps we have to look at more ceremonial functions for these sites. So what I want to do now really quickly is to look at a number of the sites in more detail, those ones that we're being studied as part of the CHERISH project, and some of the stories that we're learning from them. Our first site is Carvi Camp, Pemplidii, just near St David's. It's obviously just here, number 10 on the location map. And from this UAV drone image alone, it's quite clear that there is significant problems with erosion here. And this is again to do with the geologies. On either side of this big gash is the more resistant volcanic bedrock with the less resistant rock in between, and that's what's being eroded away. Questions are always asked about, do we know exactly how big these sites were originally, what has been lost? And that's very difficult to answer. The best that we can do is take old, perhaps 100, perhaps 150-year-old maps and actually do analysis between the two. And what we're seeing, for example, at Carvi is that we've lost somewhere around 16 meters or so of this internal area of the site in the last 100 years or so. It's a really strong defended site. It's got a whole sweep of 4 banks and ditches that define it, leading to this central entranceway that heads out onto the main interior of the promontory here. Slightly unusually here, to the other side of the entranceway, we have a coastal slope, which we don't see evidence of any of the earthworks here, so we're guessing at this point some form of timber defences. So what kind of work have we been doing at this site? Well, as in Ireland, we've been deploying the drone and with UAV survey, and this provides us a really excellent way of getting a bird's eye view and access to places that you probably can access very safely these days. So we're accessing the sort of eroding edge here, looking for archaeology that's revealed in the eroding sections, and actually we're overlaying all of these photographs to create 3D photogrammetric models, which if you go to our website below, you'll be able to subsequently then have your own guided tour of the site later. We're also targeting these sites with geophysical survey to see if we can reveal more of the archaeology that lies below the soil that we can't see on the surface. The coastal sites are notoriously quite hard for geophysics, and certainly with the bedrock here, the results were slightly mixed. But what we do have, and what we do see on this interpretation plan, is an indication of some of the archaeology, potential archaeology that survives in this eroding area. And therefore, for CHERISH and for the project, what we're now intending to do is undertake some excavation in this area, and potentially in the blank areas over here, because in perhaps a couple of 100 years, what we'll probably be seeing at this site is an island stack separated from the mainland with all the rich archaeology of the interior there. Excavation was again planned for this year, but due to circumstances, it's now been postponed. So hopefully we'll be looking to have a community excavation here next year. Moving further down the coast in the south to the limestone area, this is the wonderfully impressive and well preserved Linny Head camp. Unfortunately, for the public, it's also one of the areas of the coast that isn't accessible to the public because it's located on the military ranges on the edge of the active firing zone. And luckily for us, we've been given permission to work on the site during the non-firing months, such as during August. It's where I spoke about earlier. You can see the clear signs of erosion, and what we've been doing as CHERISH is building on earlier survey work to monitor this, to accurately record the ditch and exposed features, and to monitor erosion at the site. We're building on much earlier work at the site, and this is another important point. We visit these sites, we photograph them, but it's really important to undertake detailed survey, because actually looking at some of the survey work really helps us understand potentially the development of these sites. It's a way in to target where we might hopefully be able to excavate subsequently. And at Linney Head, we're potentially seeing 4 phases of development of the site. Phase 1 is this much smaller enclosure here, enclosing a much smaller area of the promontory, potentially late Bronze Age in date. Phase 2, we see enclosing of a much larger area of the promontory with a single bank and ditch defence stretching across a much larger area. Phase 3, we think we're seeing a embellishment of the defences, a new bank and ditch created to one side of the entranceway, where you can see parts of the scree bank still surviving on the ground surface, and ornamentation of the entranceway with the construction of this hornwork, in which we've still got some wonderful survival of the stonework in situ. This made a much more ornate entrance approach and area where people, a forecourt area leading into the inner gate of the fort. Interestingly, we think we've got a full phase of work at this hill fort, and this one's difficult to ask, but what it entails is a cross bank, which was constructed at some point. You can see it here on this lower image. And one of the things we're pondering is this actually a response to cliff collapse, perhaps potentially back in the Iron Age or first few centuries AD? Was the fort collapsing at this time and they've had to realign the earthworks and the defence around it as a response to that? So what I've just shown you there, Linney and Carvi, are standard, promontory sites, potentially very clearly defended settlement sites. But now we're going to move on to the slightly different, the slightly more unusual, and the hugely impressive Flintstone Promontory Fort. Only about 2 kilometres from Linney, on this limestone headline, which incorporates huge numbers of natural features, which has later activity. I'm just showing you a trackway here, which led to a key at the bottom end of the site for later post-medieval use for limestone, but actually a key which might well have originated earlier. You can see the dimples on the interior, which suggest hard platforms. You can see the problems of erosion at the site today, but also what you can see is the standard line of these really impressive 3-metre high defences. It's a truly remarkably wonderful site, and even better when you can see it from the air in form here. It is increasingly unusual. We've spoken to a number of people, and looking as it stands, we do feel that this natural feature described in the 19th century and named as the cauldron was it always here? So, was the choice of location here, was this chosen because of this feature? What function did this feature play in the life of the fort? It looks like we had standard occupation here, but really was that always the case? At Flintstone is in an area around 2 kilometres away from Linney, which is its neighbour to the north. But actually, if we go further south, with Flintstone, we have a series of 3 or 4 much closer located promontories, and there's some oddities there. This is Croxley Dam, which is only a couple of 100 metres away from Flintstone, and over the top of Toby here, Toby's head here, this is Flintstone. I'm just pointing you out Flintstone, the promontory fort we've just been looking at. And as you can see from the images, the character of Croxydam is so very different from any of the forts that we've just looked at. It's not defended as strongly. We've just got quite a simple ditch and bank here, but it's also almost hidden. You really can't see it from the sea. You wouldn't really see it very clearly until you stand on top of the limestone crags here and look down over the site. In fact, the only place it's actually visible clearly to and from is between the two forts of Flintstone and Croxydam. And we have to then start wondering about the relationship between these two sites. Interestingly, there's references to the fact that a potential body was found, an Iron Age skeleton was found in the ditch here, with still wearing a brooch, and evidence potentially of a couple of hut platforms which were excavated on the interior. The next nearest neighbour along is Buxball Camp, another site which we've recently surveyed, in fact last week, as part of the CHERISH project. And here again we see issues with erosion and the collapse of geology. These probably more recent formations and such as those at Flintstone. But here actually we see a striking similarity with the Flintstone Promontory Fort, both in the way the defences are, both with internal structures, and also with that Flintstone, the exact replica of a similar annex, which I'm tracing here, an earthwork enclosing a D-shaped annex. So real shared similarities between the sites. And I think it's really important to start looking at these promontories as a group to understand the relationships between them all. Now, I'm just going to really just end just to say, in saying earlier that we were pretty sure that we knew about all of our promontory sites, we are actually wondering if CHERISH, and in recent years we've made a new discovery of a new promontory site that actually sits between Croxydam Camp and Buxball Camp I've just shown you. So another one on this busy limestone headland. It's very hard to see, and it's only with the eye of faith when you visit, but we think what we're looking at here again is you've got some very subtle ditches showing through here with an entrance causeway across into just a relatively small interior. It's distinctly different from some of the other sites, so perhaps we're looking at some earlier origins on the coastline. All in all, Pembrokeshire is a really interesting location and site to study these really important monuments, and the impacts of climate change are really threatening what is a very finite resource and monument type. So I'm going to end there and say thank you everybody for listening from the whole of the CHERISH Project team. Don't forget you can visit our website to find out more, also our social media channels to keep up to date with what we're up to, and we should soon have in the next week or so our latest newsletter ready to send out to you all. So thank you.
Thanks a million, Louise, that was great. And we have a good few questions for yourself and Sandra. We're waiting for Sandra to come back. We can ask a few that were specifically for you, Louise. Rory McNeary was asking, in a previous slide you talked about the term homework, and what does that refer to?
Hornwork, yeah, it's a term which describes some of the entrance arrangement. So if you imagine it's almost like a curving piece of wall that almost curves around to almost represent a sort of a horn which encloses an entrance passageway. It's quite an ornate entrance arrangement. Quite often what we'll see at the promontories, and similarly to hillfall sites, is you usually get quite relatively simple gap way entrances, which obviously would have had big doors and gates around, but very occasionally you do get congregational areas where it's almost like defining a separate area just outside of the main gate.
Thanks, Louise. I had a question probably for both of you about, is there any evidence of contemporary relationships between the Irish and Welsh forts in terms of morphology, artefactual, place name evidence, etc.? Can you see any relationships between the forts on either side of the Irish Sea?
Sandra, did you want to answer? Or I think that you do see clear relationships in some of the senses based on architecture and form, and obviously with the dating. And I believe, although I'm not so sure on this, that some of the place name evidence could be linked across the two as well.
Yeah, I agree with Louise. I think typology, when you're looking at different types of promontory forts, you see quite strong similarities between the ones in Pembrokeshire Louise was just talking about, and some Irish examples we were discussing, particularly on the south and east coast. I see that, like, in particular in regard to artifactual, in Ireland anyways, we don't. One of the issues with promontory forts, and kind of one of the problems with developing a full chronology for them, is that we wouldn't have much artifactual evidence. This, as Louise discussed earlier, a lot more of the promontory forts in Wales have actually been excavated in, say, Irish examples. So in part, this could be one of the reasons. But and place name evidence is definite. We're seeing strong relations between place name evidence between Ireland and Wales for quite a number of our sites, and the interaction of the Irish Sea Zone.
And I think that's the important thing. This Irish Sea Zone, it's, you know, in some places it's not overly wide, and you can imagine trade and commerce between the two areas, and a busy shipping way that would have been taking place. So you can imagine definite interactions, meeting perhaps with the islands in between as well.
Thanks. Another question is, from Betsy, is would the entire community live on the promontory fort, or would some of the community live further inland?
Hard to say. I think you can see, judging on the size, at some of them, for example, St David's Head, we've probably got around 3 or 4 round houses with a few other settlements, which suggests a more of an extended family group. Some of the other much larger sites, you can just see an increasing number of hut platforms, so perhaps bigger groupings. But I think it's similar. You see it's a smaller community with other community groups around it in the hinterland, in different areas. We don't have in Pembrokeshire, for example, the huge, really major sites, perhaps like the Dinas Dintley equivalent of North Wales, or Pendinas equivalent further up the coast. So these are more smaller extended family groupings, you would suggest, judging from the size of some of them.
So a question for you then, Sandra, on the stone forts of Staig outside Cahersiveen in County Kerry and on Alioch in Donegal. Do they have any connections with the promontory forts along the western coastline? And why do we have so many forts on the west coast of Ireland?
Yeah, so what we see there also regarded as promontory forts. So as I mentioned earlier, of all promontory forts in Ireland, there is 508 are coastally located. But interestingly, Kerry is one of the counties that has kind of strong number of inland promontory forts in comparison to other counties in Ireland. And what you see with the West Coast is for us in the CHERISH Project, we work with Interreg zone funding, so we don't go any further up the West Coast and past the River Shannon. But there is a high prominence of promontory forts all along the West Coast, but we see that along the South Coast as well. You know, we're seeing it's a coastal feature that's prominent from the West Coast along the South Coast. We also see high concentrations of promontory forts along the East Coast. In most of the areas in which we're working, we'll have at least a number of promontory forts also present. So in County Kerry, for example, I'm trying to recall off the top of my head, but I think there could be something like 70 promontory forts, or 50 promontory forts on the Dingle Peninsula alone. There's, I think, 11 on the Ballyferter headland who are working on the promontory fort area ferters. So they are an incredibly common site type, and they do dominate certain areas of landscapes in the areas in which you're working. Don't know if that really answers the question, but hopefully.
Hopefully it does. So the first question we got was from Marie Fleming, and she's wondering how the various impacts of climate change are being measured and over what kind of timeline. So how far back does the data gathering go?
So for Ireland, what we're doing anyways is there isn't kind of a coastal baseline survey that's been undertaken that's the same as CHERISH, but we do look at all previous records of the site and recordings that has been undertaken. For example, with Dunbeg, we will look at the earlier antiquarian plans. But with the measured data sets that we're collecting, we are calling the initial surveys from 2017 to the 2018 period our baseline surveys, and they're giving us the comparative material, which gives us maybe exact measurements and exact change, that we have monitoring points that we can compare, and we know that we're working out the rates of erosion. But I think in Wales, Louise, you have much earlier surveys?
We do, but not such metrically accurate as the technologies that we're using today. So today we're getting perhaps centimetre accuracy. Again, we're moving back in time, and we're using earlier mapping, which again, obviously, you know, you could only say is equivalent to a metre or so of accuracy. The coast zone in Wales, as I'm thinking it's probably the same in Ireland, there really isn't, there's a poor spatially accurate data. So we have used LiDAR in the past when it was freely available, and at that point it was only 2 meters accuracy. So we do have a baseline which you could say started from perhaps the first advent of some good ordnance survey mapping 120 years ago, but it's really from this point onwards where we're getting the real accuracy. And so we're monitoring, we'll have monitoring data sets from the beginning of the project and the end of the project, but we're also monitoring following. It's important to understand the dynamics of what's going on. So we are monitoring again after events such as storm events, such as Dunbeg that's happened, so we can start to quantify the change. And actually from 2017 onwards, we've got more accurate baseline monitoring. And I think it's really important to have a number of baseline monitoring sites around both countries that can be called on way into the future to really understand the pattern and what is happening in terms of climate change and the effects of that on the monuments.
And just to add as well that our slightly different, but our colleague Sarah Davies in the University of Aberystwyth is looking at climate history. So she's looking at storm events in the past and how they tie into this kind of general overall record as well. So if you ladies have time for one last question or kind of series of questions about how do we prevent this kind of, or is there a way to prevent this type of erosion at these promontory forts, and how do the local population feel about this loss of site?
Well, I can sort of answer from a Welsh perspective. I think it's very, very, very hard to prevent this loss, because I don't think any amount of money in the world is going to change what's happening to geologies, which are quite soft and have always been eroding and will accelerate. I think what's really, really important, and where we're not there yet, is that we need to undertake more survey, understanding, record excavations, so that we actually learn more about these sites before they're lost. It's a horrible term, but it's almost preservation by record. We don't have the money, we can't move these sites. In terms of what locals feel, I mean, it's true, you can go to Facebook and listen to people that say in their lifetime they are actually monitoring the loss of these sites. And it's really hard, and it's quite upsetting, but what you can't protect everything, so all that we can do is learn from them, and also make sure that we're using volunteers and communities that can do some of the monitoring for us. So post-storm events, we can go down onto, for example, the beaches to see if any archaeology is being exposed, to see if any finds have fallen off the cliff face, and that's become very successful around the country in community style projects such as Scape up in Scotland and Citizen in England.
Yeah, so,
I was going to ask you and add on things, Sandra, before we finish up.
Yeah, I think there's different methods that can be employed, as Louise said, but each site is different, and obviously community interaction with different sites is going to vary as well. And a lot of communities, however, are very involved with the heritage of the area. It gives them a sense of place, So yeah, most communities will work to, I suppose, to try to prevent loss of features that they kind of find formative to their environment and the way in which they interact with it. But the problem is, at times you have to go to the stage of managing loss, and this is something that we hope to achieve in the CHERISH project as well. We're collecting these substantive records of sites. That's why we're undertaking excavations as well, because they give us insight into those sites we're working on, along with those site types in general that are all being affected across the Irish coastline. I think if you do take the Promontory Fort, for example, what we're seeing as an Iron Age site, we're working to a certain extent on the Iron Age coastline. So the loss of coastline has been a continual process, and much of our earlier prehistoric heritage is already lost to the sea. We see it in different areas in different ways. Of course, sea level change is local and regional, and it varies in different ways. But unfortunately, different methods have to be implemented, and sometimes managing loss is truly the best that can be achieved, because no matter how much money you spend trying to save certain sites, they're going to be lost anyways. So you could be investing substantial time, effort, and finances for a very temporary solution. So it's looking at each site individually is very important as well, because if we can preserve, and it makes sense perhaps to move a site, if it preserves integrity of the site and taken out of context doesn't lose integrity, then I think it's important we look at, you know, the different options for each individual site.
Thanks a million, ladies, and thanks everybody very much for attending this webinar this evening. Hopefully by the end of the week we'll have it on YouTube, and we'll post it on our social media channels so you can watch it again or recommend it to any of your friends. So thanks very much everybody, and thanks a million to Sandra and Louise for that great presentation. It was really brilliant, and you're getting lots of really positive comments in our webinar chat. So thanks very much, ladies.
Thanks everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.